FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome, and you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. It's March 5th, 2018. Well, if you've been watching the news, you know about Trumponomics, tariffs, how that's affecting the real world. But what is Trump really trying to do? That is the question. Hey, and I'd be remiss if it didn't mention the Italian elections, anti-immigration. It's not just here in the U.S., it's all over the place. And wow, if Italy stops taking in so-called refugee migrants, could it be another Brexit? Well, here to discuss, our good friend from dollarcollapse.com, it's John Rubino. John, happy Monday.
Hey, Kerry. It does seem to be trade war everywhere you look here. You know, last week, Trump imposed some fairly serious tariffs or announced the intention to impose those tariffs on steel and aluminum, which freaked out a lot of the global financial markets. So stocks tanked everywhere. And then this morning, he announced that that the tariffs would stay in place until a new NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, is negotiated, which basically opens the door to negotiating. Now everybody can sit down and work things out, and so you have a path to fix this. And so the market's like that. U.S. stocks opened down and then jumped to about up 200 points in the Dow right now. So what this looks like is basically Trump's private sector strategy being imposed in the public sphere. In other words, he when he's trying to buy a building or something like that and he's meeting resistance, he'll initiate a lawsuit or something to get the guys to come to the table and work out a deal. So he's kind of sort of doing the same thing here. And it's kind of sort of working, they'll sit down and they'll negotiate. And then the question becomes, whether a deal can be reached that satisfies the goals of everybody involved. And, that we'll see. And that'll be front page news on and off for quite a while here. So this is a story with legs. The whole trade issue has to go on for probably another 6 months or so or more for them to work all this stuff out. So you and I will be talking about this quite a bit going forward, Kerry.
Yeah, well, he does have a point on this, I got to say, because there's a Chinese billionaire, the most wealthy aluminum magnate in the world, has brought 2 billion pounds, I guess, of aluminum, and it's sitting in a Mexican desert waiting to get shipped gradually to the U.S. So, and why did he do that? Because if he exports the aluminum direct from China, then there's tariffs on there. However, backdooring it through Mexico, just like China does with auto parts and umpteen other manufactured products, where they'll send the parts, it's basically all a Chinese car, but it gets assembled in Mexico and they get to say made in Mexico. It's an end run around trade. And we could all argue that trade should be absolutely free and unfettered and unrestricted, but that isn't the way the real world is working. There's informal boycotts that come out to hundreds of billions of dollars a year against American producers. So, this is part of the deal. He's telling Mexico and Canada it's not going to happen anymore. NAFTA must be renegotiated or you're going to pay for it. And eventually, there's no question in my mind that if they don't start seeing reason, if Justin, can take his head out of the sand long enough to figure this out, and the guy who's running Mexico, I think it's Nieto, if they don't play ball, they're going to feel Trump's wrath. And hey, it's art of the deal in international trade.
Yeah, and I think there are competing theories here about how trade should work and does work. And the Trump point of view, which is the point of view that got him elected, by the way, so a lot of people agree with it, is that we need a manufacturing base here. We have to make crucial things like aluminum and steel if we want to have a viable military going forward, for instance, because you need those materials in order to make the planes and the tanks, et cetera, that we require if there's any trouble in the world. And if we don't make it here, it can be cut off from us. For instance, that's arguably what started World War II in the Pacific, at least. We cut off Japan's access to some crucial materials that they needed. And so they took that as an act of war, and the rest is history. The U.S. arguably finds itself in the same boat, where the industries that make a lot of stuff that we need, both militarily and for the domestic economy, are kind of shriveling up and dying. Especially aluminum in the U.S. is on its way out fast because we're not competitive with the rest of the world. Now, you could also say that that's part of China's strategy. They spent the last 10 or 15 years building up massive productive capacity, low-cost productive capacity in basic materials like steel and cement and many other things, potentially with the idea of winning export markets with that and squeezing a lot of domestic makers in other countries off the field. We have a legitimate complaint about what's happening to basic industry in the U.S. And to the extent that today's free trade agreements don't address that, in other words, to the extent that we're still declining in those basic industries, it makes sense to renegotiate the deals in ways that allow us to continue to have a viable steel and aluminum and other related industries going forward. So, this isn't a case of reasonable people on one side and crazy people on the other. There are competing goods here. Free trade is absolutely a good thing in theory and frequently a good thing in practice because it leads to people making what they're best at and then selling it to people in return for stuff that the other guy's good at. And by and large, over time, that's how the world should work. But there are cases where national interest in the short run trumps global interest in the long run. And that could be a case that we're dealing with right now. And I think it's completely negotiable. It's the kind of thing that can be worked out. These free trade agreements, as they're currently in place, aren't etched in stone. They were the process, or they were the result of a long process of negotiation at the time. And they can be renegotiated and still be a positive thing in the world. They can still lead to higher efficiency and more growth than what would otherwise be the case in the future if they're set up to allow countries like the U.S. to continue to have basic industry in some form. So I think they'll work this out. I don't think that it's going to be the Smoot-Hawley tariff all over again, that pushes us into the Great Depression. But that's assuming there's no other crisis going on.
Yeah, big assumption.
If we have a big geopolitical thing out there where we actually get into a shooting war with somebody serious, or the stock markets of the world tank in concert, which they could easily do. They're threatening to do it. We had a 1,000-point down week last week in the Dow, or at least 1,000-point 4 days down in the Dow.
Down month.
Yeah. And so we could see something like that coming at a time when trade is an open issue, when it's a point of contention, and then everything just feeds off of each other. And that's the thing that people should be worried about now, is that 2 or 3 things happening at once, creating a feedback loop that leads to lower and lower financial asset prices, which pushes us into something resembling the Great Depression. We're in a real danger of something like that happening. Oh, and then politics. At the same time that's happening, you get the Italian thing that we're going to talk about in a minute, where elections start bringing populists to power who want to tear up existing agreements and impose something new. So you got trade up in the air. You got, for instance, internal politics in the European Union up in the air. You've got geopolitics where, right now, Russians and Americans are shooting at each other in the Middle East. Let that expand.
That's true.
At the same time that you've got a financial crisis where overvalued assets start to go down, as they should. Their stocks and bonds are overvalued right now by any historical measure.
For sure.
So in normal times, starting from here, they ought to fall.
Yeah.
But have them fall while all this other stuff is going on, and you've got kind of perfect storm that is really unprecedented. We've never had these kinds of problems happen all at once in the past, and that's what we're looking at in the future. So we got to be very, watchful at the periphery to make sure that things that we're not paying attention to now don't move to center stage on top of all the other stuff that we are paying attention to.
Yeah, and hey, just like the market went down 1,100 points in a day, it could go down several thousand in a month. It's inevitable that the bull market has to end at some point. There's never been a bull market that lasted forever in the absence of a hyperinflationary event. Yeah, if the dollar becomes worth 1% of its current value, then stock prices will shoot off to the moon, Alice. But the odds of that at this particular moment, not that great. Down the road, who the heck knows?
Yeah. And we've got all the central banks of the world either draining liquidity from the system, as in the U.S., or considering doing it, as in Europe and Japan, which creates the kind of backdrop, lower liquidity that super high asset prices don't do well with. So that's there, and it's coming. There's an awful lot to think about right now, and an awful lot of risks that one can feed off the other to create a very, very scary situation going forward.
Hey, and then the election in Italy is really part of that. If Italy left the EU, I think it's the third largest economy in the EU, first Germany, France, Italy, and that would mean probably repudiation or dramatic reduction of their debt, which is higher than just about anyone's, and they'd be going back to the lira, presumably. This is stuff that really could upset and upend the whole thing, but they're tired of the immigration thing. Their leaders are bringing in all these people that don't fit with their culture, that there's no possibility of assimilation with, and they've had enough. They just said the disorder, the terrorist attacks, all of that stuff, they don't want any more of it, and their leaders didn't listen. And this is what happens when the leadership, regardless what country it is, of so-called democracies, becomes out of touch and unresponsive to the populace. Then you get these anomalous outcomes. And, Marine Le Pen, she's still around, right?
Yeah, she and other members of her family who are interesting politicians too. So, a Le Pen could end up being in charge of France at some point in the not too distant future. But, in a general sense, you can't have high unemployment, slow growth, and high rates of immigration in a democracy, because people won't vote for that mix of policies because, 60% of the population doesn't see that as a system that works in their favor. So they'll vote against it. That's what we're seeing in Europe in general. And that's what we saw in the U.S. here. You can trace the election of Trump to those very factors. The job market has not been great in the U.S., especially for people with factory jobs or other kinds of making stuff kinds of jobs. And immigration has been perceived to be really high. Mm-hmm. So you put those two things together and you get a lot of people voting for out of the mainstream populists. And that's how Trump got elected. Now, the same thing is happening in Italy, where the five-star movement is basically anti-immigration and very skeptical about the euro and the EU and the common market integrating into the United States of Europe, that kind of thing. So to the extent that people no longer see the system as it now exists as being favorable for them, they're voting for people who are against that system. It almost doesn't matter what you're for in this kind of an environment, as long as you're against the powers that be, because the powers that be are perceived to have failed. And we don't know for sure what Five Star will do. And just like in Spain, we don't know what Podemos will do if they reach power. They're a left-wing, version of Five Star, which is kind of a right-wing party, and they're all running against the status quo. Put them in power, and who knows? We'll see what they do, but it'll probably be along the lines of, well, in Five Star's case, from the right. They'll look a lot like what Trump is doing. They'll put up trade barriers and they'll scale back immigration dramatically. And they'll be very skeptical about the euro because the euro doesn't allow Italy to devalue its own currency. They have to live with a monetary regime that suits Germany. And that doesn't work for, a much less efficient system like Italy very well. It just leads to high unemployment. Yeah. We'll see all that playing out in the future, and we don't know how exactly it's going to play out. But we know in general terms who stands where, and more people that are worth talking about now are standing outside of the current system and talking about ways to change it. And when they get into power, they will try, because that's how they got elected. So that's the political story going forward. Unless the world's economies just start firing on all cylinders and everybody's working at great jobs and doesn't have time to think about politics. But that's highly unlikely. We've borrowed so much money that the system is really sclerotic now. You can't generate great levels of growth going forward if you've already borrowed from the future to the tune of whatever it is now, several $100 trillion if you include promises like unfunded liabilities. So there will never be a time, at least in the next couple of decades, when quote unquote normal levels of growth are possible, just because we got to get rid of this debt first. And so we have to have the debt crisis of some sort before we can reestablish sound money and limited government, et cetera, and go forward from there. And that's what we're looking at. And that's all the things you and I talk about, Kerry, are the side effects of all the debt that we took on since 1971 when we went off the gold standard. And until that's fixed, the news is by and large going to be bad and scary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, how can it be anything else? But think about it, John. We've crossed the Rubicon, and we're in uncharted territory. There's no plan to handle the debt. There's not even a recognition that the debt is a problem by any of our leadership in any country in the world. The only country with no debt is Russia, and I don't think that's our inspiration here. And until there's a serious look at this, the old explanation, well, we owe the debt to ourselves, so don't worry about it. But yeah, we owe the debt to ourselves. But what is that state trooper who he's retired for 10 years in Illinois, and all of a sudden he gets a 50% cut in his pension because they're broke? What's going to happen? What's going to become of that person? These are the things that have to be confronted, because otherwise we're going to have this crisis. It's better to bring on the crisis on your own terms, or as much as you can, than to just wait for the crisis to occur. And it's every country in the world that's got this debt here, John, with no desire or political will to address it. None.
Yeah. When people are doing bad things, they find rationales for their behavior. And that whole, we owe the money to ourselves thing is just a rationalization that allows them to continue to behave really badly. You mentioned Illinois. They're a great example of a system that is functionally bankrupt, and they're hanging on. They're continuing by borrowing more and more money. They're actually thinking about borrowing $107 billion.
Yeah.
In order to bail out their pension funds. They'll fully fund their pension funds by borrowing this money at the state, and probably in part at the city level at Chicago, at junk bond rates. So they'll have to pay a pretty high interest rate to borrow that money. They will fully fund their pension fund, but then they're stuck with this debt that has to, or the investments that they make with that, the proceeds from that debt, have to outperform junk bond interest rates going forward.
Forget it.
So they're going to put it into equities. They're going to bet on the stock market at an all-time high and hope they outperform, let's say, 6%, if that's the cost of the debt eventually. Now, historically, when stocks have been at current levels, they've returned something like 2% over the succeeding decade. And if that were to happen to Illinois, where they had this 4% gap between what they're paying and what they're earning, which would mean that in effect, their pension funds would fall even more deeply into underfunding, or their state budget would just be completely blown out by the need to make up that difference, then that would be the catalyst that blows up Illinois and then sets the stage for a lot more dominoes to fall. Because if a big state like that goes bankrupt or goes functionally bankrupt, we don't know what the legal process is for a state running out of money.
There's no bankruptcy for states.
Yeah,
right?
But they can still run out of money, though.
Yeah, states did default on their bonds during the Great Depression, but there is no mechanism in place for a state to go bankrupt. There is mechanism in place in many states for counties, towns, cities, municipalities to declare bankruptcy. Some states require, prior to the filing of bankruptcy, they get approval from the governor or the legislature to do so. But for a state to go bankrupt, never happened. It's the Bernie state. Let's face it. Illinois is the Bernie state. It's like everyone knows Illinois is dead. Illinois is wearing shades so you can't see their eyes to see that that there's nothing going on there, that the pupils are fully dilated and have already rigor mortis is setting into it.
Weekend at Bernie's. Okay.
Yeah, weekend at Bernie's.
I thought Bernie Sanders for a second.
Same difference.
Oh my God, is Bernie Sanders?
He's been dead for years, but his ideology certainly. But he brought it back from the brink. But look. It's a weekend at Bernie's state, and everyone knows they're bankrupt, and nobody wants to admit it. And you can only do that for so long. Imagine corporations. Imagine if they were a corporation. They just said, hey, we're out of money, but who cares? We'll just keep borrowing like nothing ever happened, and it'll be fun, and we'll see what happens, right?
Yeah. Well, the guys saying that intend to be retired by the time this thing blows up. So their goal is to get through the next election cycle, to get to their retirement age, and then hang it up with a good protected by law pension and a lot of prestige. And then they leave the mess for their successors. People have been doing that for several decades now, and it's worked. And the system has held on long enough to let a couple of generations of politicians retire comfortably. Eventually it blows up. And that's the question, when does it? How soon does Illinois become the first state to be functionally bankrupt in the U.S.?
Well, it is already. It is functionally bankrupt. They're sending IOUs out to their vendors. The vendors can negotiate those IOUs. That's been done in the past. But pretty soon they'll be sending out IOUs for their IOUs, interest on interest. Then they're cooked. When you start paying interest on interest, as my grandfather, who had an 8th grade education, said, then you got a real problem. And they got a real problem that they refuse to deal with. You've got basically the Democratic Party runs the state, even though they theoretically have a Republican governor. It's a kleptocracy. Half the money they spend is being wasted, and nobody wants to do anything about it. So they need a giant wake-up call. And let's not forget, John, people are voting with their feet. You're leaving Illinois faster than any other state in the country. And believe me, Illinois has a lot of competition, but they are moving out of there like to be a U-Haul rental specialist in Illinois. The problem is you got to get your trucks back, and nobody is moving into Illinois, so you got to go send people to get them. But, that's the favorite industry in Illinois right now is one-way truck rentals.
Well, that's how it works. Look at the border of Venezuela with Colombia.
Yeah, same difference.
And you see thousands of people walking across the border just to go to the dentist or something like that, or to buy toilet paper in a grocery store. Illinois is a much more genteel version of that, but it's kind of the same thing. When a system runs out of money, it starts getting desperate and finding new ways to take money from the people within its borders. But in the U.S. especially, those borders are pretty porous. People can just leave and they're doing it. And same thing with California. I think net outflows are still pretty dramatic there. Businesses closing shop in L.A. and moving to Utah or someplace.
Unless you're selling pot. If you're selling pot, man, California is the place to be because, it doesn't get any better than California for legalized marijuana sales. I guess we're going to have to wrap up, John, but just remember, you don't like your state, you don't like your country, you don't like your city, you don't like your county, vote with your feet. Eventually, they will get the message. Hey, as always, join us, be part of the show. The email address, I hope I've drummed it into you enough, is kl@kerrylutz.com. The Twitter feed's @KerryLutz. The Facebook page is Financial Survival Network. John's site, dollarcollapse.com. John, same place, same bat station next week.
Thanks, Kerry. Talk to you then.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.